Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents 6 Victories, North Africa, Malta and the Mediterranean Convoy War, November 1941 to March 1942, by Vincent O'Hara, narrated by Michael Page. Publisher's note. In this audio edition you will hear references to tables, figures and maps present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Introduction. Victory has 100 fathers. La vittoria trovò 100 padri, a nessuno vuole riconoscere l'insuccesso. Victory has 100 fathers. No one wants to acknowledge failure. Ciano Diary, 9 September 1942. On 23 March 1942, the 4th day of spring, a gale lashed the central Mediterranean. 2 freighters, yawing through a heavy following swell, approached Malta, while a pair of hurricanes patrolled overhead. Hundreds of islanders had gathered along the medieval ramparts guarding Grand Harbour. When the leading ship passed St. Elmo Light, the islanders cheered. The vessel was the first transport to reach the island in almost 2 months. "I felt a lump in my throat at our reception," a British officer wrote. Yet 3 days later both ships had been sunk and most of their cargo lost. The happy moment of their arrival had been a false promise, and almost 3 months would go by before another supply ship passed St. Elmo Light. Why start in Malta? The Italian admiral and historian Giuseppe Fioravanzo wrote that 2 critical operational and logistical vectors intersected in the central Mediterranean, an Italian vector running from Italy to North Africa and a British one stretching from Gibraltar through Malta and on to Suez. The war could have been won locally if one of the 2 antagonists had on their own broken the line of the other, he wrote. The chafing of these vectors generated much of the conflict between the Axis and Western Allies from June 1940 through May 1943. The period from November 1941 through March 1942 is especially important. The intertwined struggle during these months to maintain Malta and to supply the armies in Africa illustrates the importance of sea power. It shows how maritime dominance is secured, how it can impact land operations, how it is maintained, and what consequences its loss carries. In October 1941, Great Britain had lofty expectations of winning a decisive victory in the Mediterranean. The Admiralty acted to intensify its attacks against Axis maritime traffic and assist a forthcoming North African offensive by basing Force K, comprising 2 small cruisers and 2 destroyers, at Malta. At first, Force K proved wildly successful, and British warships won powerful victories in November and December 1941. By the middle of December, the Royal Navy had a chokehold on the Axis army in Africa. The British Army had ended an 8-month siege of Tobruk and was advancing through Cyrenaica. Yet over a span of just 36 hours, the Italian Navy won 3 critical victories that frustrated British ambitions and dramatically transformed the balance of power at sea. The period ended with the triumph of Axis sea power, confirmed in the late March 1942 Second Battle of Sirte, the failure of the MW-10 convoy to Malta, and the suppression of Malta as an offensive base. Axis control of the operational logistical intersection enabled the Panzerarmee Afrika's subsequent capture of Tobruk and its advance deep into Egypt. This book's title, 6 Victories, reflects how military success is often measured in terms of big events, and not without cause, yet its approach to this subject also reflects the cumulative impact of little deeds, and the narrative will reflect this. It may seem full of detail, but detail is the essence of the matter. In these details, such issues as doctrine, technology, training, and command are best illuminated. Only the details can show how communications and intelligence, along with logistics, infrastructure, and geography, influenced operations and impacted the application of sea power. In the details are found the lessons that apply today and into the future. These hundreds of details are the true fathers of victory. The importance of time and other conventions. The Mediterranean War was fought over 3 time zones: Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, labelled here as Zebra or Zone, including Great Britain and Morocco. Alpha, or Central European Time, was 1 hour ahead of GMT and included Spain, Italy, Germany and North Africa between Algeria and Libya. And Beta Time, which was 2 hours ahead of GMT and included Egypt and the Middle East. During the period covered in this work, late October 1941 through the end of March 1942, both sides kept summer time. Thus, clocks were advanced 1 hour from GMT, which was always solar and never adjusted for summertime. The Axis powers set their clocks to alpha plus 1 hour for summertime, no matter what time zone their forces operated in. In shorthand, this is expressed as Z plus 2. The British, on the other hand, generally, but not always, used local time as adjusted for summertime. As a result, forces in Malta followed alpha plus 1 hour for summertime, Z plus 2, while forces in Egypt may have their clocks set at beta plus 1 hour for summertime, Z plus 3. However, all messages containing information from Ultra, the Allies' top-secret message decoding process, were time-stamped with GMT, regardless of where or when the intercepted and deciphered information was generated. To avoid potential confusion, this book uses Central European summertime, Z plus 2, throughout. Because Ultra dispatches were always expressed in GMT, the listener simply can add 2 hours to any Ultra timestamp to reconcile with book times. Times are usually expressed in a code with the time in 24-hour format given first. For example, 0010 is 12:10 a.m. and 15:05 is 3:05 p.m. Next, if necessary, comes the zone where Z indicates GMT. If no time zone code is given, book time is used. Finally, 2 digits indicate the date, so 10:15 Z 19th indicates 10:15 a.m. on the 19th day of the month, GMT. 23:25, 3rd, is 11:25 p.m. on the 3rd in book time, Z plus 2. Generally, the month and year will be clear from the context, but if not, they are spelled out. In the terms Axis and Allies, Axis powers means Italy and Germany, and British is shorthand for British Empire. Thus, when in Chapter 1 the text states that British troops were sent to Greece, this shorter form is used in preference to the more precise description, that the force included Australian, New Zealand and British troops. In similar fashion, Axis troops generally refers to a combination of Italian and German forces. Italian means Italian forces only, and German indicates German forces only. The word miles always refers to nautical miles unless otherwise stated. The metric and imperial systems of measurement are used interchangeably, although the imperial system is preferred. Chapter 1. Sea Power and the Mediterranean, 1940 to 1941. To try to be safe everywhere is to be strong nowhere. Winston Churchill. From June 1940 to May 1943, the central and eastern Mediterranean and North Africa between Suez and Tripoli were the principal sustained battlegrounds for the air, land and sea forces of the British Empire and the Kingdom of Italy. Germany entered the campaign in January 1941, and the Americans did not arrive in force until November 1942. The campaign was characterized by dramatic advances and sudden swings of fortune. With the Sahara Desert to its south, North Africa was like an island. It produced nothing for the support of armies. Every article required for life and war had to be carried there, one account observed. These realities limited the size of the armies and made logistics the overriding concern. Relative supply states and long lines of communication caused the campaign's seesaw advances, retreats, and protracted duration. Because air transportation could satisfy just a small fraction of the materiel requirements, the combatants had to supply North Africa by sea. Accordingly, sea power was crucial to the conduct of the campaign and to its outcome. In its broadest sense, sea power is the ability to transport personnel and material freely over the oceans and the ability to deny the enemy that use. Sea denial is the ability to limit the enemy's maritime traffic even if one's own sea traffic is limited. In 1940, the British and Italian admiralties regarded the battle fleet as the principal instrument of sea power and believed that defeating the enemy fleet was the best way to assert sea power. In 1937, Rear Admiral Oscar di Giamberardino, a well-regarded Italian naval theorist, wrote, "The objective of every offensive at sea can only be the enemy fleet, and the goal is always and only its destruction." Italy's war plans of 29 May 1940 expressed the intention to commit the bulk of our naval forces, battleship squadrons, as soon as possible against the opponent, before its forces in the Mediterranean can be greatly reinforced and when the battle can happen closer to our bases than the enemy's. Indeed, both sides believed that a fleet action was key to exerting sea power. In the Royal Navy, as its official historian observed, the tradition of seeking decision with the enemy by battle at sea had long been a fundamental precept in the maritime services. In his first action after Italy's declaration of war, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, ordered the battle fleet to sweep the North African coast to test Italian reactions. His initial goal was to achieve control of sea communications in the central and eastern Mediterranean. To accomplish that, he wrote, the destruction of enemy naval forces is a necessary course of action. Appreciating this concept of sea power makes it clear why admiralties treasured their capital ships and regarded the use of battleships, cruisers, and even destroyers to defend or attack traffic as secondary assignments that only diverted such vessels from their primary missions. This concept of sea power determined the building programs of both nations, and consequently prescribed the composition of the naval forces that faced each other in the Mediterranean. It defined their training and influenced their use. This was especially true of Italy's navy. The Regia Marina spent much of its limited naval budget on modern battleships and heavy cruisers. It trained its fleet destroyers to support the big ships in daytime actions. Its battle doctrine focused on long-range gunnery. When Italy declared war, it had a pair of excellent battleships about to enter service, but it did not have effective sonar or radar. Its secret Special Forces unit, Decima Flottiglia Mas, was equipped with unreliable prototypes. The Navy had only 5 modern purpose-built anti-submarine warfare escort vessels. It did not have magnetic triggers for mines or torpedoes. It had no nighttime surface combat doctrine for warships larger than destroyers. Its doctrine for the defense of sea traffic did not envision the routine use of fleet units as convoy escorts. Its weapons and doctrine were important and useful, but in the particular kind of war in which Italy now found itself fighting, the weapons and doctrine that it did not have proved more relevant to the tasks at hand. The decision by both sides to fight an offensive war in North Africa, along with Britain's resolve to defend Malta, set the parameters of sea power in the Mediterranean. For the British, sea power was measured in order of importance by the ability to supply their army in North Africa from outside the theatre, to maintain maritime traffic within the theatre, particularly to frontline ports, and to supply Malta from both inside and outside the theatre. For the Italians, sea power consisted of maintaining maritime communication along the Italian coast and between the mainland, Sicily, Sardinia, and Albania, supplying North Africa, and ensuring the movement of maritime traffic to the western Mediterranean, particularly Spain, and in the Aegean and Black Seas. For both sides, it also included the ability to interfere with enemy traffic and to conduct offensive operations, such as bombardments or amphibious landings, as required. An underappreciated fact of the Mediterranean naval war is that each side had only limited power to interdict its enemy's most important maritime routes. Between June 1940 and May 1943, the Allies did little to interfere with Italy's domestic traffic, which averaged more than 35 ships a day during this period, and there was hardly anything that the Axis forces could do to hinder Allied traffic arriving via the Red Sea, at least after April 1941, when the British captured Italy's naval base in Eritrea. On the other hand, each side had periods of success in stopping enemy traffic travelling either from Italy to Libya or from Egypt or Gibraltar to Malta. Late 1941 to early 1942 was a transitional period when both sides waged the battle of sea control and denial in classic and innovative ways. After a brilliant start, British forces faltered, and the Axis powers emerged supreme in the central Mediterranean. Some context is required to understand these changes fully. Major campaigns that last for months and involve hundreds of thousands of personnel, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of ships are not fought in isolation. The Mediterranean was not a self-contained theatre of war. It was only a corner in a global conflict. The first item to examine is why the Mediterranean North African campaign was fought at all. Given Italy's position as a peninsula in the central Mediterranean, its dependence upon maritime lines of communication to sustain its economy, and its demonstrated vulnerability to maritime blockade, the Italians naturally sought to control the central Mediterranean. Ideally, they also wanted to secure the British-held exits of the Strait of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. Moreover, the Suez controlled the access to Italy's East African possessions, and in June 1940 the capture of the canal seemed an achievable objective. Accordingly, after the armistice between France and the Axis, a North African land campaign became a key component of Italian strategy. At the same time, the Mediterranean had long been Great Britain's main transit corridor to the Middle East, India, Malaya, and Australia. When it became apparent that Italy was contemplating war, Britain terminated all trans-Mediterranean commercial traffic and withdrew all but a small fraction of its naval forces to Gibraltar and Egypt. Given this, it is natural to ask why Britain would fight in the Mediterranean at all if there was no maritime traffic to protect, especially when the British Isles were threatened by a possible German invasion. One answer is that Britain needed to defend the eastern Mediterranean to protect its supply of oil from the region. A second is that the British also decided to wage an offensive campaign in the central Mediterranean and to defend Malta despite the difficulty in supplying that island. The British War Cabinet made this decision in September 1940 as part of a strategy that identified the British Empire's vital interests and defined a roadmap for defeating Germany. This strategy persisted even after the Soviet Union, the United States, and Japan entered the war. The British plan declared that the foundation of the Empire's strategy would be the wearing down of Germany by ever-increasing force of economic pressure. A blockade was key, as it had been in World War I from 1914 to 1918. So was oil. The document read, "Apart from ending the war by the defeat of Great Britain, Germany can only improve her oil position to any material extent by driving out our fleet from the eastern Mediterranean, thus ensuring seaborne supplies from Romania and Russia. Therefore, the security of our position in the Middle East is of the utmost importance to our strategy, not only as a base from which to exercise and intensify economic pressure, but as a barrier to prevent our enemies from breaking the blockade." In short, London considered defence of the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East to be a vital component of the only strategy that would offer a chance of winning the war. Moreover, the Mediterranean was also the only area where effective offensive action was possible. Direct attack on Italy may be the first important step we can take toward the downfall of Germany. In perspective, the Mediterranean North African campaign was fought because it was there that the vital interests of Italy and Great Britain clashed. Still, Britain's top priorities continued to be home defence and the protection of seaborne trade, especially in the North Atlantic, and defending these vital interests sharply reduced the number of forces that otherwise would be available for the Mediterranean and Middle East. There was also the need to account for other threats to imperial hegemony, particularly in Singapore and Malaya, which up through May 1941 the British Chiefs of Staff, although not the Prime Minister, considered the most critical interest for the Empire after the home islands themselves. German intervention in Africa in February 1941, followed by the Reich's invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April, upset the Mediterranean's balance of forces and threatened Britain's overall position. But the situation improved in June, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. That attack transformed the war's strategic dynamics and gave the British Empire what it most needed, a powerful continental ally. The Soviets were a partner the British did not hesitate to embrace, despite mutual distrust and ideological differences. Although in the short term the thrust of German forces into Russia exposed the Middle East to Axis invasion through Turkey and the Caucasus, London saw an opportunity to seize the initiative. In October 1941, after 16 months of fighting, Britain had slightly improved its original position and was on the cusp of securing an important strategic success over Italy. An offensive that seized all of Africa would bring great reward, and Germany would be too busy in Russia to do much about it. To seize this opportunity, the British launched a campaign in Africa called Operation Crusader. The Parallel War, June 1940 to January 1941. At the beginning of 1940, Italy deployed 9 small infantry divisions in Tripolitania to watch the French, and sent 5 such units to Cyrenaica to face the British. Since Comando Supremo, the Italian High Command, expected that the combined French and British Mediterranean fleets would blockade Libya, its war plan of 8 April 1940 called for a defensive stance sustained by a 6-month stockpile of supplies. The Navy would not need to run convoys to Africa. The collapse of France in May 1940 invalidated everyone's plans. Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini declared war on 10 June, anticipating a quick victory and a seat at the peace table alongside German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. With the powerful French fleet and army no longer a factor, Africa suddenly seemed open to exploitation. Yet Supermarina, the Italian Naval High Command, had only 2 battleships available, both refurbished World War I-era vessels, and lacked enthusiasm for the all-out naval offensive that Mussolini had proclaimed, at least until its new battleships were ready. As for attacking Malta, Supermarina concluded in an 18 June 1940 study that it is not conceivable to attack from the sea with a landing of troops without an intense and protracted preventative aerial action of many days to produce the maximum devastation and exhaust the supply of anti-aircraft ammunition. Italy attacked Malta by air on the war's first day. 94 S-79 trimotor bombers raided the island, dropping 27 tons of bombs. But Italy lacked the aircraft, doctrine and infrastructure required to maintain the type of sustained air campaign that the Navy wanted. Moreover, the Air Force considered such a campaign pointless. Its raids were enough to keep the British Mediterranean fleet from using the island as a base. With few forces on the island, Malta did not threaten traffic, and with peace anticipated before the end of the year, it would have been foolish to risk decimation of the Italian Air Force in a sterile bombing campaign. In June 1940, Malta was toothless, and the crystal balls in Rome did not foresee the island's future impact. On 16 May, even before Italy declared war, the British Admiralty had suspended all merchant traffic in the Mediterranean. It had no choice, given Italy's large submarine fleet and the fact that traffic had to transit the Sicilian Strait within a few dozen miles of enemy air bases. The closure instantly added 20,000 miles and more than 2 months to the round trip between Suez and the Clyde. On 16 June 1940, when it was clear that France would seek an armistice, Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, wrote to Admiral Cunningham that he believed that the Atlantic trade must be our first consideration, and ordered him to explore and prepare for the withdrawal of the fleet from the eastern Mediterranean. In a narrow vote, however, the British Defence Committee, chaired by the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, decided to defend Malta. In addition to the obvious political reasons, Churchill needed quick victories to maintain the nation's will to fight and its international credibility, and sensed that they could be won in and around the Mediterranean. In Rome, meanwhile, the Italian government scrapped plans for a purely defensive posture in North Africa and decided instead to mount an offensive towards Suez. The capture of Mersa Matruh would bring Italian air forces within range of Alexandria and hopefully drive the British fleet from the Mediterranean. The eventual capture of Suez would open a supply route to Italian East Africa. The decisions on both sides gave the navies of Great Britain and Italy tasks that neither had anticipated before the war. The British needed to sustain Malta, and the Italians needed to build up and support an offensive force in Libya. British strategy during this period presumed that Italy was the weak link in the Axis alliance. The elimination of Italy and the consequent removal of the threat to our control of the eastern Mediterranean would be a strategic success of the first importance, the British War Cabinet concluded. Italy's power of resistance is much less than that of Germany, and direct attack on Italy and her possessions in Africa may be the first important step we can take towards the downfall of Germany. In other words, Britain undertook major offensive operations against Italy in the Mediterranean because it could not do so elsewhere. In the war's first 8 months, the British and Italian navies fought 2 fleet actions and 6 smaller naval engagements. Britain attempted to control the central Mediterranean and reopen it to traffic with a knockout victory over the Italian fleet. This led to the action off Calabria in July 1940, which resulted in an inconclusive skirmish that saw both sides claiming victory. Whatever the claims, Italy's routine traffic in the central Mediterranean continued unabated, while British traffic from Malta to Suez remained blocked, although the British did run heavily escorted convoys to Malta in September and October. A British carrier raid against the major Italian naval base at Taranto in November damaged 3 Italian battleships and permitted accelerated shipments to Malta, but its effects were relatively short-lived, and Italian battleships opposed the next Malta supply operation from Gibraltar 2 weeks later. Malta had minor strategic value during the parallel war period of June 1940 to January 1941. As a former head of the British Naval Historical Branch wrote, "It has generally been claimed as having conferred command of the sea upon the British. Such a claim is highly questionable at this remove of time, as the Italians were able to go about their more important occasions, supplying the Italian armies in Albania and Libya across the breadth of the Mediterranean with near daily sailing of convoys and single ships. The first convoy from Italy to Tripoli, carrying 937 men and 2,775 tons of supplies, arrived on 26 June 1940. There were also 73 return convoys involving 158 ships, of which only 1 was lost. In sum, during the parallel war period, total Italian traffic to and from Africa, excluding coastal convoys, involved 331 commercial vessels, of which 4 vessels, 1.2%, were lost. Traffic to Albania, Greece, and the Aegean Sea in this period totaled 1,480 commercial vessels, of which 0.8%, in terms of gross registered tonnage, was lost. Italy's efforts to oppose supply operations to Malta were similarly ineffective. In the parallel war period, the British sent 28 transports in 8 convoys to Malta, but Italian forces damaged just 1 ship. There were several reasons that British forces sank less than 1% of Axis shipping in the central Mediterranean, Adriatic and Aegean seas during the parallel war period. First, British rules of engagement were designed to limit unrestricted attacks to warships and escorted convoys. Otherwise, stop-and-search rules applied. The Royal Navy maintained these rules until February 1941. Second, most Italian traffic to Tripoli favoured the western route along the African shore, yet the British directed reconnaissance operations and most submarine patrols from Malta toward the shorter eastern route. It took British intelligence until mid-December before the realization at last dawned upon the naval authorities at Malta and Alexandria that Italian shipping was being routed to the west. Moreover, Allied submarines did poorly. For example, when the hostilities began, the 3 Allied boats that were deployed from Malta were lost on their first war patrol. Although both sides could expect their convoys to arrive safely during the parallel war period, British
Sample complete. Ready to continue?